Last week we talked about that wonderful ayah of the Quran, Ayatul Nur, um, which is the light, the verse of light mentioned in Surah Nur. And Nur is, it's a wonderful term, it's a wonderful concept. That light, sometimes people have kind of been almost mechanical in the way they describe what Nur is. What is God's light? And it's sort of, oh, it's belief, it's faith, it's guidance. But I think you can actually feel, you can feel what light is. And light is, of course, it's guidance, but it's also inspiration. It's that air of positivity. It's that kind of feeling of love in your heart. It's all of those things. It's something just beautiful that just kind of contrasts with darkness. So the verse in the Quran where Allah says that Allahu waliyul ladina amanu, that Allah is the close friend of those who believe, and He takes them out of the depths of darkness, yukhrijuhum min adh-dhulumati ila an-nur, towards light. Yeah. So that can also be depths of darkness, of despair as well, can't it? Towards positivity as well. So subhanAllah, the ayah of Nur, we won't go through it all again, but just, a little reflection on that, which directly connects to what we're going to be talking about today in our short time, inshallah, which is that the verse talks about how you have a candle or a lamp, and it's surrounded by a glass. And, we've talked about how one interpretation of that glass is like the body, and that lamp is your heart. It's your heart that's emanating this light, God's light. And through the glass, it just transfers through, so that whatever your actions are, they just reflect what's in your heart as well. So if your heart is full of love, your actions will express that love. Yeah. And it will fill the room. Now, all of you, mashallah, I know you guys, you are amazing people, and you're all going to go off and do amazing things, inshallah. And, your rooms will take different shapes and sizes. Your rooms will be the doors that Allah has opened up to you through your life. Okay, but if your heart is just emanating that love and that light of Allah, and it comes through the glass, that radiant glass, and it just shines out into your room of whatever shape it is, then inshallah it will create transformation. Yeah, you will be a source of good, of happiness for those around you, and a source of light, spiritual light, and kind of positivity as well in all those around you, inshallah. And I look forward, if Allah gives me life, to see the amazing things that you go on and achieve. And in some ways, the light, the spiritual light, God's light, is slightly different to real light. So, the word light is obviously a metaphor, and it's not actually what it is. Because this is a light that can continue to reflect and continue to glimmer even when the candle has gone out. Yeah. So even when our life is gone, our light can continue to shine, the spiritual light. If your light has affected other people's hearts, if it's affected other people's lives, if you've done something that's going to continue to create that change, that spiritual kind of revolution around you, then even when your light is gone, that light is still shining on, subhanAllah. And that leads very nicely into this concept of Tajdid that we're going to talk about now. So Tajdid, which means kind of, the word Jadid means new. Tajdid is a process of renewal. Okay, and it's an idea that is well established in Islamic tradition, and it comes from a hadith. I have to say, hand on heart, I'm not sure exactly how accurate that hadith is, but I think it's been embraced by scholars throughout the centuries. Let's just go to with me 1 sec. Where are we? Yeah, let's just go to the whole idea of what is our purpose. The purpose of Islam, you might say, is to bring that iman into people's hearts and bring that connection to God, and through it effect change practically in our actions. As Surah Asr says, it's got to be iman and actions, right? So, you know, the people should change, societies change as a consequence of religion. So, you know, if that is our purpose, and we've seen that in the Quran, وَمَا خَلَقْتُ الْجِنَّ وَالْإِنسَ إِلَّا لِيَعْبُدُونَ, we haven't created man and jinn, well, jinn and man, except to worship us. That if worship, which actually means to please Allah, which means to have that connection and that desire and that actual, you know, ability to go on and do something that will please Allah, right? That's ibadah, and that's our fundamental purpose. So Islam, throughout humanity, from the time of Adam alayhi salam to our present age, has had that purpose. But of course, at times, people have come along and misguided individuals, misguided groups of people, societies, and as a consequence, people have, you know, misunderstood God and have also been led into behavior which is harmful to others and harmful to themselves. And it's at times like that that a kind of renewal is required for people to be brought back to God, for people to have a refreshing of their understanding of what the religion is supposed to be guiding them to in their society, in their time. And so you could say that essentially that is Tajdid. In which case, in some ways, all of the prophets were mujaddids. They were also people who renewed. So Islam, if it is that timeless, you know, non-tribal creed that was there from the outset, but it took different manifestations, slightly different manifestations in different times, then those manifestations were brought by prophets. Essentially, the prophet comes at a time when there's a need for him, right? And they come and they express the message with an emphasis on what the needs are of that time. Yeah, and that is actually what mujaddids do later on as well. So the hadith itself is, I'm just thinking, are we going to go through, where are we going to the Prophet? Oh yeah, there, yeah. Yep, okay. So the hadith itself goes that, and it's narrated in Abu Dawud, that Allah will raise at the head of each century such a person for this ummah as will revive its religion for it. Okay. Now, actually, when you look at this term, you know, sometimes people have read this as the head of each century means the beginning of a century or the end of a century. So they've been very mechanistic in the way that they've interpreted that hadith. But actually, you know, like Maududi interprets it and says that it just means at critical times in each century. So, you know, and even the century doesn't have to be taken literally as a century. Very often the Prophet ﷺ, when he used numbers, he meant, you know, something that it was almost like the number itself was metaphorical. So, you know, very often the Prophet will say 70 or 70,000 you know, he would have said things like that. Didn't mean exactly 70, not 69, not 71, but exactly 70. But it gives you an idea of a large number, you know, and 70,000, even larger number. Yeah. So centuries, like, you know, sort of periods of time throughout history, critical junctures, you might say. And that's essentially what the hadith is about. Now, the other thing is that it uses the word man, which doesn't have to be singular. So very often people have understood it in the singular and they've gone, okay, right, so in that century, who was the person that made a great difference? Well, I think it was this person. Well, I think it was that person. Okay, but it doesn't have to be an individual. Man can be used in plural. So you could really translate this verse as Allah will raise at critical times such people for this ummah as will revive the religion for the people. Yeah. Then Maulana Maududi has gone through the whole concept of Tajdid, and I think it's a very useful sort of analysis of what, or a proposition of what Tajdid is about. Okay, he goes into a few pages describing in detail what the ideal mujaddid or mujaddids ought to be. Okay, and I think when we look at what Maulana Maududi writes, and generally whatever he's written, you have to understand the context of this guy. So Muhammad Maududi is like a scholar, a thinker, quite a radical thinker, really, of the 20th century. And I have to say, some of his writings I don't like, parts of his writings I do like. You know, there might have been a time when I liked his writings more, but I think that he's not really always very relevant to our context. He was a man of his time, and he, you know, he wrote in relation to his context, as all scholars did, you know. So he was around through quite a sort of transitional phase. He was born either at the very beginning of the 20th century or the late 19th century, but into British India. And British India was, you know, not a brilliant place, in all honesty, and there were grave abuses by the British government in India, and of course there was a great sense of frustration for Indian people at the fact that, you know, they're being ruled, you know, kind of indefinitely by these people who are, you know, have no interest in really learning about the country, getting involved in it, but are largely fundamentally exploiting it. And we see that time and again through the period of the British rule of India, and, you know, countless famines and everything. But I'm digressing. Just read *Inglorious Empire* and you will see, by Shashi Tharoor. So, you know, you can understand why people were very frustrated. And as Muslims, they will have seen that, you know, not long ago there were very large Muslim empires, and you know, with these empires, there's a relative amount of a kind of freedom for all religions under that empire, stability, prosperity, you know, the kind of encouragement of free trade and travel, relatively low taxes, good levels of education, culture, if you're religious, the freedom to practice your religion without hindrance. So, you know, there were lots of very positive things. So he's harking back quite often in his writings to that time. And, you know, his idea of the ideal Mujaddid has a very strong political dimension as well. That this will be someone who sort of brings back the political glory of Islam, etc. And it harks to a time that was essentially pre-UN Charter, you could say, because the UN Charter really changed things massively, where, you know, since then, there has not been a kind of massive infringement on the territorial integrity of countries. There has been some wars, there have been some annexations, of course, you know, and generally, at least verbally, the international community has responded, and sometimes they finally pull their finger out and actually physically responded as well, to try and rectify things. But it's a very different context to the one perhaps of earlier times. So, you know, you have to kind of, when you see Muhammad Maududi's writings, you have to look at them through that lens of his context. So anyway, so what he says about Mujaddid is that they're people who diagnose the ailments of the Muslims of the time. Okay, but I think it doesn't necessarily just have to be Muslims, but the elements of the society that they're in. Okay, and they put forward a scheme for reformation, how to kind of, you know, make a change, essentially, right? And with that, you know, even if you're going to be comprehensive in creating a change, really you've got to have some priorities that you're going to focus on, and that's, in some ways, that brings out the sharpness of the intellect of a Mujaddid. That they're not overwhelmed and just thinking, oh, that's bad, I'll change that. Oh, that's bad, that's bad, that's bad. Okay, no, but let's get to the heart of it. What are the real ills in society? What do we really need to focus on? What's creating, you know, can we quantify, can we create a sort of a scale of how much harm is occurring through what? And let's focus on that, essentially. And this is the next factor, that the Mujaddids aren't idealists, and they don't expect that somehow they can pray and suddenly the world will change. Okay, but they're pragmatic. They understand the limitations of their resources, and so they're quite astute at directing their resources appropriately to make sure that they get the most practical results. They also create an intellectual revolution, all right? So they try to disseminate their way of thinking, disseminate learning amongst people, yeah, and then have schemes for practical reforms as well, to bring back the ethics in line with the teachings of Islam. They're also involved in ijtihad. So ijtihad is basically where you're looking at the rule set. And of course, there are certain rules which are unnegotiable, right? Like alcohol and adultery, etc. So not those, but there's lots of things that are actually contextual. They're actually cultural. So it's about reevaluating those and saying, well, in our new context, you know, how should Islam manifest itself, essentially, yeah. And then he talks about other elements that relate to those global political objectives, which I would say, you know, are not relevant to our context at all. Okay. So the interesting thing is that if you use those sort of criteria, that you actually find that prophets themselves were also mujaddids. Yeah. So if you look at, for instance, Shu'aib alayhi salam, Surah Mutaffifin, that he's talking about, that he was criticizing his people for cheating in trade. So they would weigh things and they'd fiddle with the weights and essentially give low measure back to people. Yeah, and that itself was the big message for him to the people. Sort this out. Of course, as well as believing in God, but practically, this is something that needs to change. Musa alayhi salam, of course, when he went to the Pharaoh, his message was that you've enslaved an entire peoples. Yeah, and the way that these people are treated is you know, preposterous. It's barbarous, and this has got to end. Free these people. Yeah, Isa alayhi salam, a beautiful message of spirituality. That at the time, you know, people were all believers, but they were very formalistic in their religion, and their idea of the expression of faith was the perfection in the outward form of their expression, and the heart was just not mentioned. It's not important, didn't matter, you know. So his teachings were really focused very heavily on just that, you know. And it's not that he denied the rest of the law, but he didn't need to talk about it, right? That wasn't the need of the age. So of course we have our own prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, the last prophet, Allah's blessings and peace be upon him, who we know, you know, ticked all the boxes for a prophet. He, you know, in the kind of the ideal mujaddid sense, he ticked all those boxes. But what about afterwards? So I want to just have a look at Umar radiallahu anh, and I think there's lots of, you know, interesting learning from his life. So Umar, we all know, was an exceptionally bold person. You know, companions talk about how Umar was like a fortress for Islam. Before he came, we used to hide and pray. And after Umar became a Muslim, we can actually pray openly. That's just such a massive thing. And that, you know, the fortress of Islam was kept strong. And that after he died, then it started to crumble. SubhanAllah. This is, you know, that's the kind of, in some ways, it's just like the physical strength, isn't it? And where the Prophet ﷺ said that when Umar walks along the road, Shaitan crosses the road. SubhanAllah. So as a personality, he had boldness. But actually, what's also interesting is that, you know, he had a, SubhanAllah, amazing intellect. And he was bold in his analysis of the problems and the needs of the time as well, right? To the extent that he would even question the context of verses, rulings in the Quran, and say, I don't think this is relevant anymore. We should suspend it. Yeah. So, for instance, one of the biggest things that we owe to Umar, definitely today as well, is his contribution towards the collection of the Quran. I'll talk about that for a moment soon. Okay. But when he became a Khalif, you know, the changes were phenomenal. phenomenal. And we know that Islam just grew hugely after, or the territory, shall we say, of the empire, the Khilafah, grew just absolutely remarkably, as amazingly, after he became Khalif. Also, though, and probably because of the other changes that he made, this actually happened, and with it came a huge amount of stability too. So he made so many changes. He established the Islamic calendar. He made a huge change in the military sense as well, because he set up a paid army. And in some ways, before, armies were they're just raised up in response to a need, in reaction to a need, and you just rallied the population and said, come on guys, we've got to get together and we've got to fight this threat. Okay. As a consequence, people weren't getting paid for what they did, but in those days the way they got paid was through booty. Essentially, if they survived, they had some booty and they came back with it. And we know the trouble that this can cause, and did in the Battle of Uhud. So Umar said, well, they're being paid, why do they need booty? When they conquered, just trying to remember now, I think Syria, when they conquered Syria, the Muslim army calculated that each person would walk away with 3 slaves, because it was such a huge area and it was all theirs. So they could just take it as booty and divide it up, and 1/5 of it goes back to the state, 4/5 of it they can keep, right? And including slaves. So he said, so he actually put an end to this. But this is sanctioned in the Quran, and it was a rule that was relevant at the time of the Prophet. But Umar said the context has changed. They're paid now. And this is going to cause, the other argument he made is that in Syria, if the whole country is like, harvested for slaves, and just the land is divided up amongst the people. So it's not just the material, but actually the land as well is divided up amongst the conquerors, then actually it just destroys the economy completely, as well as obviously the damage it does to the population. So he said, no, everyone's going to stay where they are, and we'll just extract taxes instead. Let people continue to live as they are, let them prosper, and we'll just take taxes. And that will then benefit, because otherwise all that happens is that those soldiers have done very well, but the state itself hasn't continued to get benefit. Whereas this way it continues to get benefit. So you can see that actually this was like a win-win for everybody. Maybe not as big a win for the soldiers perhaps, but they're getting paid anyway. So that was, I think, like a massive change. Also, he had checks and balances set up. He saw that there was a potential threat for abuse of power by the governors. So he would have people that would actually spy on the governors, keep a close eye on them, and he would regularly take them away, circulate them, to ensure that there wasn't a kind of growth of their power base of any one individual. He changed the categories of who is entitled to zakah. So in the Quran itself, it says that converts are entitled to zakah, and at the time of the Prophet, the context was that becoming Muslim was a huge hardship, and very often for physical reasons alone, people were wary of becoming Muslim. And Umar said, actually now people are coming into Islam in droves, and there's no need to encourage them anymore. Mashallah, they're coming. So what do we need to have that category? That zakah could be spent better elsewhere. So he actually suspended that category, even though it's stated clearly in the Quran that they're entitled to it. Of course, that doesn't mean that we have to apply Umar's rules in our context. But do you see the point, that as context change, you have to reevaluate? Yeah? Okay, and this other factor is quite dramatic, actually, that Umar changed the way that jihad was. This is the military jihad. Of course, there's spiritual jihad as well. There's the struggle that we have in our lives. But this is the military jihad. He changed the way that was fought. Up until his rule, jihad was always defensive, and then he changed it and made it offensive as well. Now, the reason for that was because he knew what the Arabs were like. He knew them well. So again, it's about seeing threats. And he knew that if you left them too idle, they'll just start fighting amongst themselves. So one of the reasons was keep them distracted with the borders. But the other reality is the exact converse of that, you might say, that in that time, there was no such thing as the UN Charter. There was no such thing as your borders are secure and they're going to be mutually agreed by all the countries of the world. And, you know, if one person should infringe on another country's border, one country, then all the countries will join together and oppose that through all sorts of means. You know, nowadays, you know, you'll have sanctions, and then eventually, if they can muster an army, they'll actually defend the offended country as well. But there wasn't anything like that. So actually, in those days, empires were always a dog-eat-dog situation. There was a constant threat from any neighboring empire, and there was a constant state of war at the borders. So you can see how, you know, there was a rationale for, well, if we don't fight, then they're gonna fight us anyway. And certainly at the time of the Prophet, as he secured Arabia, the Romans sent huge armies to the borders with an intention of infringing. But then they were kind of like fought back by the companions. So these are some of the changes that just demonstrate what a phenomenal intellect Umar was. Now, the interesting thing also about Umar is that when he made these changes, it's not like the companions all went, yeah, Umar, spot on, brilliant idea. Wow, you know what? I was thinking exactly the same as well. But Umar as this thing, he was bolder than your average person, bolder than even the best of people. You know, there was something very specially bold about Umar in the way that not only people were scared of him, but that his insight and his kind of courage to actually make changes which others would think are too radical, you know? So let's look at the Quran, for instance. So this hadith is, this is only part of the hadith actually. Amazing hadith by Zayd bin Thabit, who was the principal collector of the Quran. And he tells the whole story in Sahih Bukhari of how it happened. But I just want to read out the actual words so you can actually see the kind of dynamic between Umar and Abu Bakr. So at the time of Abu Bakr's Khilafah, there was a big war, and many people. Oh well, let me just read it. It's there. It's right there. So Zayd bin Thabit, who was one of the scribes of the Revelation, but of course he was more than that. He was also the principal collector. We'll see that later. So he said that Abu Bakr sent for me after the casualties among the warriors of Yamama. So that's the name of the battle, in which there were 360 companions that passed away, and many of the Huffaz, the ones that had done hifz of the Quran, were amongst those companions. So it was a pretty dreadful battle. And so Zayd comes to Abu Bakr. When he turns up, Umar is there as well. And Abu Bakr says that Umar has come to me and said, the people have suffered many casualties on the day of the Battle of Yamama. And I'm afraid that if there'll be some casualties amongst the Qur'an at other places as well, a large part of the Quran may be lost unless you collect it. And I'm of the opinion that you should collect the Quran. So this is Umar suggesting it to Abu Bakr and seeing the threat, right? So Abu Bakr says that I said to Umar, how can I do something which Allah's apostle hasn't done? You see, so Abu Bakr, in his immense love for Rasul and his love for the religion, saw his expression of that love in wanting to hold on to everything that the Prophet had done, alayhi salatu wasalam. But Umar saw it differently. He's saying, yeah, if you want to hold on to the message of the Prophet, the message, then you have to respond to threats. You've got to look at the challenges and you've got to respond to them. Otherwise, the message itself will change and it'll be lost, right? So Umar said to me, "By Allah, it's a really good thing." So, and he kept on pressing with his arguments. and trying to persuade me to accept his proposal until Allah opened my bosom for it, and I adopted the same opinion as Umar. So imagine before that, there were fragments here and there, and the Quran was in your heart. If you wanted the whole book, it was just in your heart. It wasn't in a book form, right? And interestingly, you know, Abu Bakr is telling this story. This is the humility of Abu Bakr, that he's the Khalif, and he's telling Zayd bin Thabit that, look, you know, I was totally against this. It just felt really wrong because the Prophet had never done it. But Umar, he just carried on until eventually, you know, I started to understand. I saw the way and this whole time, you know, amazing, subhanAllah, the humility of Abu Bakr to confess this. You know, any other leader would sort of say, we've got this great idea, you know, but he just accepts humbly that he was opposed to it. And this whole time, Umar is just there, but he's sitting there not speaking. So subhanAllah, anyway, they persuade Zayd to do the collection of the Quran. So you can see that you know, honestly, what an amazing revivalist Umar was. Now, again, this doesn't mean that everything that Umar did or said, you know, we would necessarily endorse today. But the big message there is that this is a person who was totally inspired by the message of Islam, devoted to it to the last, to the point that, you know, all he was concerned with was the akhirah and the benefit of the people that were his responsibility, subhanAllah. And he would do anything to preserve the faith and the welfare of the people. So, you know, his humility is legendary, isn't it? Like when he was going to Jerusalem, he would swap with the slave that was traveling with him. And as he entered Jerusalem, he was holding the camel and the slave was on the camel. And all the grandees of Jerusalem were rushing out to the slave. And the slave's like, whoa, it's not me. This is the guy that you're wanting to meet down here. SubhanAllah. Anyway, so yeah, I'm waxing lyrical about Umar. But remember, I'm not saying that, you know, we necessarily endorse everything that he did, because you know, his behavior was relevant to his context. Okay, but so moving on, through the centuries, there have been revivalists at every time, and you know, very often you don't think of them in that context, right? But now that we're getting a sense of what a revivalist is, when you look at these scholars, you now start to understand that because not only were they just amazingly profound people in terms of their love for God, in terms of their ibadat, their worship, and you know, their scrupulousness, but actually in the intellect and the fact that they responded to challenges, right? So if we work our way through, you can see that you have, for instance, the Imams of Hadith. What did they do? They collected the Hadith into books, and they were conscious of the threat to the teachings, the stories about the Prophet ﷺ. So Umar had done the same thing with the Quran, and very early on had ensured that that threat was contained, it responded to appropriately, right? But many centuries later, we had the same kind of threat with Hadith. Well, many centuries, okay, we'll talk about that later. Okay, but sometime later, there was the same threat to the actual stories, the message, and the words of the Prophet ﷺ. So then the Muhaddithun exerted a tremendous effort. It's a phenomenal effort to preserve his words and his teachings. And we will go into that later, inshallah. And we had the Imams of the Aqidah, so like Imam Tahawi and others also, who collected the creed, the beliefs of the religion, because those were also being threatened. So their response to that was to say, okay, this is what the majority of people believe. This is our interpretation of the Quran, etc. And Imam Tahawi, for instance, was so eager that the basic creed is preserved that he put it into a little booklet, and you can see it in English now as well. And it's really short, so you can spend literally half an hour, maximum 1 hour, and you've read it, and you know, as long as you haven't got any disagreements with it, that's it. You know that you basically understand and agree with what a Muslim is meant to believe. That's a phenomenal service. The laws, the actual teachings, the rights and the wrongs according to what Allah wants us to follow, were also being lost. And in fact, that was preserved before hadith, because even if the exact stories of the Prophet kind of, weren't preserved entirely accurately, what's really important is that the right and the wrong and the rights of people are preserved. So that was the challenge that the imams of the madhabs responded to first, actually, before hadith, in fact, before aqidah, before many of the things. One of the first things that they put a lot of their intellectual energy towards. And I think we will be studying that next week and for probably about 2 or 3 weeks afterwards, inshallah, as well. Then there was things like defending the territorial integrity. Salahuddin al-Ayyubi was a great example of that. The spirit of the commandment. So kind of in the same way that Isa alayhi salam had responded to the tradition becoming very formal of the practice of the religion and the kind of obsession with the outward form of the religion. And this is how things were at the time of Imam Ghazali. And I think, he probably felt guilty about the fact that he himself was part of that culture and that mindset. And that's why he just broke away from it all and then came back and wrote Ihya Ulumuddin, which basically blended the two together and, helped us all today now to inject the spirit, that love into the practice as well, subhanallah. So those are examples. If we go further and further towards our present day, you could say that there was a big threat in the 19th century, 18th and 19th century, where most of the Muslim world was essentially gobbled up by European powers. And these were predatory. It's not like they were doing it for the benefit of the conquered people. It wasn't, the sense of like, an obligation towards the world that they have to help the world rule and advance and all. It just wasn't like that at all. This was just like, Britain is taking over half of Africa, so France must take the other half, because obviously Britain and France are constantly enemies. Maybe that's why Britain can't tolerate being in the EU. So that's why they literally had this kind of race to conquer the world. We saw it in Africa. It occurred in India, but Britain kind of predominated. It occurred in America as well. And so, for Muslims, when you see these foreign powers who have a completely alien culture, which from a Muslim perspective seems, completely ungodly, because they're drinking, there's just a completely different culture in so many different ways. And essentially they are sucking out economically the strength of the country, and also kind of very cunning in the diplomacy, because there's the idea that, we're for your benefit and all that, but everyone knows that that's just not true. So of course there are many ways that people respond to that. We did that in the residential, we covered that, and then Uncle Dilwar covered this last term as well, didn't he? That there were the kind of responses of, let's just preserve the faith and not interact with society. Other people said, oh no, hang on a sec. What's made them great? Oh, it's science. Well, let's study that. Let's look at what happened to the Muslim world. Why did we fall behind? And let's respond to that. Other people said that, no, we've got to actually fight. We need to take this to the military level, etc. But you can see that there were people that were thinking and analyzing and coming up with their own responses, which, you have to respect them for in their context. So here, this is just a nice little illustration here of how much was taken up when. So this is the 18th century, the 1700s, and you can see that, a lot of Africa, the central northern part of Africa, was taken by the French, and then you've got, can you see my cursor there? Do you see cursors? Just out of interest. No, anyone just chat yes or no? Can you see any cursor wiggling about?
Yes, we can.
Oh, good, good, good. Okay. Yes, there you go. Africa. But can you see also in America how actually, you know, in fact, before this, a lot of America was French, funnily enough. And this part of America is all Spanish. And then so this part was French, the British are at the top. And obviously, somehow we prevailed. And the British had just got huge swathes of different parts. Okay, this is as late as 1914. In 1914, you can see this is, sorry, the colours are all different, but the UK, Britain's got the pinky, sort of like sickly pink coloured territory, including Canada. And look at France again, it's got this huge swathe throughout Africa. And Russia itself was also an empire. You know, these areas here, all Muslim, and also around the Black Sea, all the area around the Black Sea, including, see that little purple knobble that's jutting out? Can you see it, almost diamond shaped? That there is Crimea. So Crimea was all Muslim at one time as well. So this whole region had been conquered by the Russian Empire. So you can see how those people had to respond. Some people didn't, but the great intellects of the time did respond. As you know, lots written about them, but I think for our context, we don't need to dwell too much on that. But what we do want to then think about is that now, you know, so whatever people wrote and whatever they did in response to that, you know, kind of, you know, the notion of Islam versus the West, and the West destroying the Islamic empire, and the West imposing its culture upon us, and you know, kind of forcing us into poverty by extracting all the riches of the country and exploiting it. So that whole context is beginning to fade into history, right? Of course, there's elements of neocolonialism, you might say, in the Muslim world, no doubt, you know. But of course, our context, you, me, you know, the people that are here signed in right now, our context is totally different to that, right? But we do have a very different context to the one in which many of the books on Islam were written, right? And many of the practices, many of the ways of thinking are all connected to you might say, ancestral, for those who aren't converts and, you know, native British, you might say, but people like myself who've got ancestors that came from India or, you know, Arab countries, etc. So there's a massive shift in the context, the situation that we're in today, totally different. Does that then not require us to do the same kind of tajdid that was done by all of these people of the past, the prophets, you know, that it's not a new religion, but it's that the emphasis has to be adapted to the priorities of the time. Yeah, so the priorities change. It's not that you're talking about a new religion, you are not changing the creed or the worship, of course, but what teachings are most important to emphasize will change according to the context, right? They have to. That's what the prophets did. So this whole process is part of the kind of tradition of tajdid. So tajdid is not heretical, right? But what's the tajdid about? It's actually about saying, okay, considering the way that things have changed so much, how do we ensure that the essence and the true message of Islam, the spirit of the religion, what Allah actually wants, the light of the religion, continues to shine in this new context or the new land? Yeah, that's what tajdid is about. And we will delve into that more in subsequent weeks. So we're actually going to kind of, you might almost say, using tajdid as an excuse, to do a bit of a catch-up on the madhabs, on the imams of the madhabs. So inshallah, next week we'll talk about Imam Malik. I think we'll have time to do Imam Malik and Abu Hanifa. And then after that, we will look at the differences between the madhabs, why they're there, how does that reflect on our situation now? Do you have to follow a madhab? Which madhab should you follow? Am I going to tell you which one? You know, that kind of thing. Then we'll look at hadith as well after that, and the imams of the hadith, but also then the science of hadith, how hadith were preserved in response. So we're kind of just going back to previous Mujaddidis because they're relevant to our understanding of the religion as well, inshallah. And then we'll finish this whole kind of module with a look at, okay, how's our context changed? Not going to come out with solutions, but just why there needs to be a re-evaluation of what's important in Islam for our current day, inshallah. There we are. I apologize. I actually just talked and didn't do much interacting. Right. Can I just hand over to Sarah? Would you be able to talk about it? Is that possible? I know Hannah has already said something about it, but would you be able to say a bit more?
Assalamu alaikum. Can you hear me? Sorry, I didn't realise Hannah's already spoken about it. That's fine. That's absolutely fine. I was trying to sort myself out, and I probably missed the first few minutes.
Oh, okay. Yes. So we have maths class. What's the date again?
Okay, 14th of March.
14th of March.
Saturday, 14th of March in Birmingham. Has Hannah gone through the topics?
Yes.
Brilliant.
So.
Okay.
I don't know. Have we gone through each and every one? We didn't go through the full line.
Okay. Shall I do that then?
Yeah. Go ahead.
Okay. Assalamu alaikum, everyone. We have our next campus masterclass on Saturday, the 14th of March. It's from 10:15 to 6:30. And it's at the Hub in Birmingham. The poster's out. Hopefully you've all seen it. If not, do please let us know and we'll share the poster and the ticket link. And if you could share it with friends and family. So it's for 17 to 26-year-old. It's called Love Actually. We've got Henna Zavati speaking, Sheikh Munir and Sister Batul Al-Toma, looking at love, relationships and marriage. There'll be lots of time for questions and answers with all the specialists and scholars. So hopefully it'll be a really informative day.
Thank you. Jazakallah khair. Right, any questions? Would anybody like to speak or tap a question? Welcome to do that too. No? Okay. Well, of course, we've got the WhatsApp group, so if you've got any questions there, please, avail it, inshallah. Okay, we'll wrap up and look forward to seeing you next week, inshallah. Subhanakallahumma wa bihamdika ashhadu an la ilaha illa ant astaghfiruka wa atubu ilayk. A'udhu billahi minash shaitanir rajim. Bismillahir rahmanir rahim. Wal 'asr innal insana lafi khusr illa alladhina amanu wa 'amilus salihati wa tawasaw bil haqqi wa tawasaw bis sabr. Subhana rabbika rabbil izzati amma yasifun wa salamun ala al mursaleen walhamdulillahi rabbil alamin.